The title is, Why Do We Leave Our First Love? All right, what does the Bible say? We are continuing from last week. Now, last week was just wanted to let you know what I think about Revelation. I hope you guys have recovered from last week. I got quite a bit of emails, and I gotta say, they were very positive. Surprisingly, the texts and the emails I got were extremely positive about last week, and I'm very thankful for that. And like I said last week, Revelation is one of the books that we can actually disagree about, and we're still all going to go to heaven. Regardless of what your view is on the end times, it doesn't matter. But this week we want to deal with the first 3 chapters of Revelation, and basically everybody kind of agrees on the first 3 chapters. It's when we get to chapter 4 is when people start parting ways, okay? And so what does the Bible say? And so let's just start looking at this. And the first verse we want to look at, we're just going to hit a couple of verses in the first section here in chapter 1. And it says here, this letter is from John to the 7 churches in the province of Asia. And Asia was a Roman province is in what is now Western Turkey. Western Turkey. All 7 of these churches that this letter was written to was in Turkey, what is now considered Turkey. Okay? And so let's look at the map here. And this is a back view of this. And so to the east, you would see Greece, and then you would see the boot of Italy. And if you went south, you would get more into the Middle East and towards Israel. But that is what you see, that the roads there. That is actually a postal route roads. Those are that is Turkey there. And so let's get a little closer view. Let's zoom in a little bit. And so what we see here, this is a postal route. This is, let's see if I can write here on this. This here is the Island of Patmos. All right, and that is where John is writing from. The Island of Patmos is really a penal colony. And John has been put there because he has been preaching about Jesus. It is about 60 miles southwest of Ephesus. And Ephesus would be the most prominent town of the 7 towns mentioned here. And Patmos was about 10 by 6 mile mountainous island in the Aegean Sea, off the coast of Asia Minor, what we would call Turkey now. What's interesting, Ephesus at this time is actually on the coast. Now, I have been in Ephesus. I'm actually going back to Ephesus a year from this coming September. And when you stand in Ephesus, and I'll mention this in a few moments in the third section when we're talking about Ephesus in more detail, the water is like 6 miles away. And the river has brought in so much silt, is brought in so much silt that now it's not on the coast anymore. The coast is 6 miles away. But at the time of this writing, it is on the coast. And so the island of Patmos had a sizable population, but it was really inhabitable. It was hard to live there. okay? It was hard to live there. And they sent prisoners there because they were criminals. And John was sent there because he had been preaching. And so, like I said, this here is basically a postal route here that you can see, all right? And so these are the 7 cities that that he preached to, or these letters were sent to, right here. And kind of fascinating, all 7 cities are in Turkey today. Kind of fascinating. All right. And so we drop down to verse 9, and it says, I, John, am your brother and your partner in suffering and in God's kingdom and in the patient endurance to which Jesus calls us. And then John just tells us how he got to Patmos. I was exiled to the island of Patmos for preaching the word of God and for my testimony about Jesus. Okay? Now, I believe this was written somewhere between 64 to 67 A.D. John probably lived to around 95 A.D., and he was the last of the disciples to live. All the other disciples died a pretty horrible death. They were all martyred. John is the only disciple that died what we would say a natural death, and yet at one time he was thrown into a boiling pot of water. Now what's fascinating is all 11 disciples, after they saw Jesus rose again and that he was alive, all 11 disciples, John is the only one that went to Jesus' crucifixion. And he was the one standing by Jesus' mother, and Jesus looked down from the cross and said to John, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, take care of Mom, from the cross. Kind of incredible that from the cross, Jesus basically said, take care of Mom. And the other 10 were hiding. And what you find is the other 10 are in hiding, but those 11 disciples, after they saw Jesus, all of them preached, and 10 of them were martyred, and all of them were tortured, and not one of them changed their tune. To me, that proves more about the resurrection than anything I can tell. Not one of them, because they could have backtracked their words and got out of torture. And not one of them ever did. And it's just amazing to me. So here John is on the island of Patmos because he preached Jesus. And he's taken to this terrible place to live, and he's there because he was preaching about Jesus. All right? And so John is on the island of Patmos because he's preaching about Jesus. And here's the deal that I find fascinating. Part of the reason, and I'm just going to throw this in there, and this goes with last week. One of the things that people say is that the church will not go through the tribulation. And when I sat in eschatology class, when I was in Bible college, they would talk about the pre-tribulation. Those of you who are listening to this, talk about the pre-trib. And for those of you who don't understand what I'm saying, there's a 7-year tribulation for those of you who believe in the end times where there will be a tribulation period, and there's a 7-year tribulation. But the pre-tribulation people believe that before the tribulation starts, the church will be raptured before that. Then there's a mid-tribulation group that 3.5 years into that 7-year period, halfway through, the church will be raptured up. And I would sit in class and go, John, who wrote this, went through torture. The 11 disciples were tortured. And all through church history, Christians have been tortured. Go get you the book called The Fox's Martyrs, Book of Martyrs, and just read through history. They talk about right now that there are over several million Christians a year are being murdered around the globe right now, every year in this world that we live in. And I go, why would we think that your church is going to be saved through the tribulation when today in our world that Christians are being murdered every day in our world? Why would God save the church when history is full of Christians being murdered for the cause of Christ? I've never understood that. And here John is being, in a sense, tortured because he's been thrown to this island. So I've never understood that. And you could say this book could be written and called The Normal Christian Life, Prosperity Gospelers Need Not Apply. If you wanted to look at this book. So I've never understood that years ago when I was in my young 20s, I just never got that. And yet that's what pre-trib teach. And I just never have understood that. But I digress. Let me get back to this. All right, here we go. All right, Revelation 1:20 says, "This is the meaning of the mystery of the 7 stars you saw in my right hand and the 7 gold lampstands." And John has gotten a vision, and in this vision, there's somebody holding lampstands and these 7 stars. And it's no mystery. It comes right out. He's been called the Son of Man. And this is been told to us going all the way back to Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. This is a title that Jesus uses in the New Testament. And like I said, it goes back to Daniel. The Son of Man is Jesus, all right? And so Jesus is explaining what the lampstands and the 7 stars mean. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And so here we have, Jesus is telling us in chapter 1 what are the 7 stars and what are the 7 churches. And he's telling us all this. The 7 stars are the angels for the 7 churches, and the lampstands are the 7 churches. So he's telling us, he's explaining what this first vision are. A lot of times in Revelation, the visions are explained, and then sometimes they're not. But what's very clear is in chapter 1, John is telling us that the book of Revelation is written to these 7 churches. And first 3 chapters, everybody agrees, are for these 7 churches. What is interesting to me is, how is the first 3 chapters written for these 7 churches, and then in chapter 4, they're somehow written to us? I don't see that. And that goes back to last week. I hope that makes sense to you, all right? And so, like I said, Jesus Christ is in John's vision and explains the meaning. So Jesus now becomes our teacher and our interpreter, and he explains that to us, all right? And then let's go to this question here. And I think this is a good question for us. And I touched on it a little bit about the prosperity gospel. So talk about this in your hot spots. How does the book of Revelation contradict the false teaching of the prosperity gospel? So we'll talk about that in your groups. All right, chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation address the 7 churches that John greeted in chapter 1. So chapter 1 is a greeting, and then it takes chapters 2 and 3 for him to address all 7 churches. And so here are the verses of all 7 churches. And so what does the Bible say? All 7 churches follow a distinct and similar pattern. So I'm just going to go through this and give you the pattern. And so the first pattern is a characteristic of Christ is drawn from Revelation 1. I'm just going to give you one of these. For instance, in Revelation 2:1, it says, "Write this letter to the angel of the church in Ephesus. This is the message," and now here's the pattern of Christ. "This is the message from the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 gold lampstands." That's in Revelation 2:1. That's talking about how Christ walks with the 7 stars in his right hand, the 7 gold lampstands. That is taken from 1:20, where it's talking about that's what Christ does. And so you see, with every church, it starts talking about something about Christ. And so you can find that with every church, something is mentioned about Christ taken from chapter 1. And then a word of commendation and praise is if it's appropriate. Every church, but except Laodicea, is the only church that didn't have a commendation. All right? It's the only church that they don't say anything good about. Every other church had at least one thing said positive. So there's only one church that didn't have a word of commendation. And then a criticism for their sins, right? 2 churches did not have criticisms. I'll mention that in a moment. And then a word of correction and warning, if that was necessary. Again, there was 2 churches that didn't have correction given to them. And then a challenge and promise drawn from Revelation chapter 19 and 22, and then other texts throughout Revelation if necessary. And then these were 7 historical churches in Asia Minor or modern Turkey at the end of the 1st century. So all 7 of these churches existed, all right? And these churches were in and around Ephesus, which was the principal city in the province of Asia at that time. Ephesus, again, was the seaport, and it was the most important of the cities. And as I said earlier, these cities were on a significant postal travel route, and they're addressed in a counterclockwise order regarding their location. So there's a system on the way that they are addressed. And each of the messages have a word of wisdom and application for all the churches throughout history until Jesus comes again. Now, some people look at these churches and again, it does not correlate, but they look at them as the 7 ages or dispensations of the church. And usually this is churches like us in the West interpret this as the 7 ages or dispensations. If you don't know what that means, good. But some people look at that God in different dispensations treated people differently. And I don't believe that. And so if you've never heard that, good. And so don't believe that. All right? And so only 2 churches did not have criticism. Smyrna in chapter 2, 8 through 11, and Philadelphia, chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. Now, what that means is you will go through and drive around, and every once in a while you will see a church that will be called First Smyrna Baptist Church or First Philadelphia Baptist Church. You don't hear the other churches ever named, okay? It's only Smyrna and Philadelphia because they didn't have criticisms. The other 5 churches, nobody ever names their church after those 5 because they were criticized in Revelation, all right? And then I want to tell you this story, and we'll close this section with. This is the story of Polycarp. Polycarp is the pastor of Smyrna. He is a personal disciple of John who wrote Revelation. So I just think this is a cool story, and it kind of goes along with what we're reading here. Polycarp was a personal disciple of the Apostle John, and he's an old man, and he's the bishop of the church of Smyrna in Asia Minor, and persecution against the Christians broke out there, and the believers are being fed to wild beasts in the arena. And so the crowd begins to call for the Christian leader, Polycarp, who's the bishop at the church. So they are actually feeding Christians to wild beasts there. And so the authorities send out a search party to get Polycarp, who's the bishop. And so they actually torture 2 slave boys to find out where Polycarp is, where he's being hidden. And so it's a Friday afternoon, and they go and they find him resting in a country home. And so, like a posse, they go and get him. And Polycarp, his friends try to sneak him out, and he refuses, and he says, God's will be done. And so they go and they get him. And so when they find Polycarp, he's sitting there, and he says, hey, guys, have a seat. He has food brought to the posse who's trying to take him to the arena where they want to feed him to the wild beasts. And he just says, hey, guys, before you take me to the arena, can I pray for an hour? He actually prays for 2 hours, and the posse's having second thoughts. What are we doing arresting this old man? Because he's an old man. He's like 85 years old. And yet, they got to still take him. And so despite the cries of the crowd, when they get him there, everybody's thinking, this is ridiculous. We're going to kill this old man. And so when Polycarp is brought into the arena, the proconsul guy goes, hey, man, just curse Christ and we'll let you go. Just curse Christ. And Polycarp goes, man, what he said was, I'm 86 years old and I've served him. He has never done me wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who has saved me? And so they go, all right, we got to figure out a way to let him go. And so they said, then do this, old man. Just swear by the genius of the emperor, and that will be sufficient. And the genius was some sort, of like, you're saying, you're kind of saying something on the spirit of the emperor, which would be a recognition of the pagan gods and religion. And he realized, I can't do that. And so Polycarp said, if you imagine for a moment that I would do that, then you think, you pretend that you don't know who I am. So hear it plainly, I'm a Christian. And so Polycarp stood fast, and so they decided they were going to burn him at the stake. And so that's what they did. They burned him at the stake. And the writing from that time said when they burned him at the stake, it didn't smell like flesh burning. It smelled like bread baking. That's what people wrote. And somebody walked over to him and stabbed him and killed him as he was burning to death. Isn't that incredible? Polycarp was 86 years old and he died. It was on February 22nd, and the year was probably 155 AD. And he was the last student of John who wrote Revelation to be alive. And again, that's when I go back and I say, all through history, men and women have died for the cause of Christ. Why would the church be resurrected before the second coming of Christ? I don't understand. All right, let's get to this question. What can we learn from the story of Polycarp, who is the bishop of Smyrna, one of the churches that had nothing bad said about them? All right. I'm going to just read through these pretty quickly to get to the scripture part. I'm not going to deal with each church. I'm just going to deal with Ephesus because it's probably the best story of them. And I've already dealt with Polycarp for Smyrna. And so though its importance was diminishing, Ephesus was a politically, economically, and religious significant city in the first century. It served as Asia's political center and was dubbed the supreme metropolis of Asia. All right. And commercially, the major thoroughfares met there, and a significant seaport was still present. However, silt left behind by the Cayster River was accumulating near the harbor's mouth and would eventually cause the city's prominence to fade away. I think right now, like I said, it's about 6 miles away is the water. You can see the water, but it is a long way away when you stand in Ephesus and look to see the water. The city served as a primary location for the worship of the fertility goddess Diana, which is the Roman, or Artemis, the Greek. The Diana temple became renowned as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and a symbol of tremendous national pride. The temple employed thousands of priests and priestesses, many of whom engaged in religious prostitution. Now, that was going on in the city while the church was there doing their thing. Christianity was a big deal in our history there in Ephesus. Paul, Aquila, and Priscilla established the Ephesus church through evangelization. We see that in the book of Acts. Paul spent at least 2 years working in the city because he thought it was necessary as a gospel outpost. We see that in chapter 19 of Acts. His tenure as a bishop was not without incident, and there was a riot over the Diana temple there. Paul later met with their elders at Miletus. We see that in Acts 20, and in the early 60s, he addressed one of his prison letters to them. So how can we obey? Let's start looking at some verses here. In verse 2, it says, I know all the things you do. I've seen your hard work and your patient endurance. I know you don't tolerate evil people. You have examined the claims of those who say they are apostles, but are not. You have discovered they are liars. And so this is a good thing that they do. Doctrine is really important to them. And so Jesus is pleased when he sees our good works. And so that's something that we are really good, that is really good when Jesus sees that, we're doing something good. And so this is a plus sign, we would say, about Ephesus. They're guided by their moral behavior. The purity of life was a hallmark of this Christian community, okay? Now, as we go on in verse 3, it says, you have patiently suffered for me without quitting. This is another plus sign. This is another good thing. And so we see that Jesus is pleased with our dedication, our devotion. And so they had faced special challenges. Like I said, there was a riot that broke out about the Diana temple there. They refused to bow down to the goddess Diana or the emperor or the images of the emperor. They were dedicated, devoted to their faith, and so this is huge. And so John is pointing that out in this vision that he is seeing that Christ is talking about. And so this is a big deal. And so this is awesome. Again, another positive. So I could see this church listening or reading this, that they're hearing that John is saying, and they're like, oh, this is great. And, it starts off about the church at Ephesus in chapter 2, and they're going, oh, this is awesome. This is great. And then we go on in verses 2, and also we're going to jump down to verse 6. I know all the things you do. I've seen your hard work. I'm going to read that again. In your patient endurance, I know you don't tolerate evil people. You've examined the claims of those who say they are apostles, but are not. You have discovered they are liars. And then verse 6 is very short, but it says this, but this is in your favor. You hate the evil deeds of the Nicolaitans just as I do. Now, the theology of the Nicolaitans can be seen in the description of the evil works of the church of Pergamum in verse 15. And what did the Nicolaitans teach? Well, they taught about the immorality and idolatry that appear to be heresies, and that they tried to teach in the church of Ephesus and Pergamum. And they actually go back all the way to Balaam, what was taught, that Balaam taught in the Old Testament. They tried to teach eating meat that was sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. And we don't know all what the Nicolaitans taught, but we do know they taught that. And so they were against that. And so that's a big deal. And so Jesus is pleased when we have sound doctrine. So doctrine is really important. And so the Ephesus church had been taught under Timothy. It had been taught under Paul. And so this church is theologically orthodox sound. And so Jesus is pleased with the Ephesus church, and God is pleased when we are orthodox sound, when our doctrine is right. Okay? So that's important for us to know. And so you say, what is orthodoxy? What is right? It's when you believe about Jesus is correct. When you believe that Jesus is 100% human and 100% God. When you understand what it means to be saved. When you understand what the gospel is. That kind of thing. That's what you need to really understand what the Bible teaches, how you should live your life, that kind of thing. All right? So, let's go on. Verse 4 says, now this is when it gets tough. But I have this complaint against you. You don't love me or each other as you did at first. Now this is pretty harsh. Jesus is being honest with them. And here's the deal. Jesus is honest with you. Jesus is saying, hey man, I've said some good things about you, but this is a big deal. And here's the thing. He's saying that they've left their first love. And here are the 4 things that people have said. What love had they abandoned? Was it their love for one another? Was it their love for God? Was it their love for the gospel? Was it their love for Christ? We don't know. They don't tell us. It could have been it could have been all 4 of these things. We don't know. Christ in this vision doesn't set it out. But here's what we know, the kind of love we should not lose. This is in Matthew 22. This is Jesus speaking. He said, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. We should love God with everything we have, and we should love each other. And then he goes on in verse 5, and he says, look how far you have fallen. Turn back to me and do the works you did at first. If you don't repent, I will come and remove your lampstand from its place among the churches. And so, remember from where you have fallen. And what I have found is, when we have fallen, it doesn't happen by accident. Typically, it happens because we replace what we love with other things. Does that make sense? It just doesn't happen. Other things get in the way. And what we have to do is we have to repent and return. We got to go back to what we have walked away from. And we got to get back to that. And it's important that we do that. And so think about these things this week as we strive to become more like Christ, as we study the Bible, serve others, and share our faith together.